Good evening, and welcome to the Harold Isaacs Global South Seminar Series for Spring 2022. I'm Professor Bonnie Levine Berggren, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Global South Seminar. This lecture series is named after and endowed by the late Professor Emeritus Harold Isaacs, who served as a history professor at Georgia Southwestern for 49 years. During his tenure at GSW, Professor Isaacs taught courses in Latin American history, African American history, and established minors in Black Studies and Third World Studies. In 1981, he launched the Third World in Perspective seminar series, and 2 years later, he established the Association of Third World Studies. In 1984, the Journal of Third World Studies followed. This journal addressed the problems and issues facing the less developed countries all over the world. Following Professor Isaacs' death in 2015, the name of the journal was changed to the Journal of Global South Studies and is now published by the University of Florida on behalf of the Association of Global South Studies. As part of his bequest to GSW, Professor Isaacs requested that part of the monies be used each semester to bring a guest speaker to campus to talk to our community about issues and opportunities facing the Global South. Tonight, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Eric Spears. Dr. Spears is the Mildred Miller Fort Foundation Eminent Scholar and the Chair of International Education at Columbus State University, where he also serves as an Associate Professor of Geography. Dr. Spears earned his doctorate in geography from West Virginia University, specializing in political economy and political ecology. His dissertation focused on urban development and sustainability in Brazil. He also holds a master's degree in international political economy from the University of Warwick in England. Dr. Spears has worked in Brazil for 25 years through research, leading study abroad and service learning programs, and international exchanges. Additionally, Dr. Spears also focuses on East Asia, which allows him to work with the Asian Studies Development Program at the East-West Center in Hawaii. At Columbus State University, Dr. Spears oversees the Center for Global Engagement and coordinates the university's International Studies Certificate Program. Tonight, he's here to share his expertise with us on Brazil's foreign policy on China and its political economy paradox. After Dr. Spears concludes his presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask him questions. Welcome, Dr. Spears.
It wasn't turned on. This is why you get a liberal arts degree. It's called critical thinking. See, the skills are transferable in the real world, right? As you have to deal with, public pressure and observation with technology as it's falling apart in front of you. Good evening, everyone. Again, it's good to see all of you here, and thank you very much for the warm and generous reception and invitation to be here at Georgia Southwestern. I was here for another Windows to the World event about 6 or 7 years ago, and I think it's a really fantastic program that you have here. So it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about realistically an ongoing research project that I'm working on, mainly with Brazil, but as you see in the cover slide here, that there are two flags represented. One with Ordem e Progresso, which is the Brazilian flag, which says order and progress, and the other of the Chinese flag. And as mentioned just a few minutes ago, interestingly enough, I have some interest in East Asia. Primarily, however, I do Latin America and I look at Brazil. But I've always been a student of East Asia since I was in high school. In fact, when I was able to choose my first history class as a sophomore in college, I chose Chinese history instead of the other standard ones that most students take, like American history, for example, or British history. So I've always had this fascination. And as you'll see through the presentation tonight, you'll see how these two different countries will kind of merge together in contemporary globalization and what are some of the challenges with that. But first and foremost, I need to say good evening properly from a Brazilian perspective. Boa noite, as they say, which is good night, or good evening, right? So boa noite, and sejam bem-vindos. So I'm always happy to welcome people to sit and listen and talk about Brazil, and I'm glad that you're all here this evening. So let's talk about what we're going to focus on tonight. Let me just give you from the outset. This research project is something that emerged as we all did in isolation in the pandemic. You sit and think a lot, right? And actually a research project that I was scheduled to do in the summer of 2020 got canned because of COVID. I was supposed to go back to Brazil and pick up on a longitudinal study that I started 20 years ago with my dissertation research. I wanted to go back to the same place and look at localized geographic change and urbanization with a particular community, which would have involved interviewing people, which means during a pandemic, you don't go down and talk to people in the slums and interview people. So in the midst of pandemic isolation, Zooming, and sitting way too many hours on the internet, I start thumbing around parts of Brazil to figure out what's happening. What could I possibly think about or do from here? And part of this was course development, where I teach at Columbus State University, and the other part of it was really related to some scholarship. And I learned through an indirect detour of sorts by looking and studying the Belt and Road Initiative from China, which we'll talk about briefly tonight, that Chinese foreign direct investment has gone up in Brazil. And what I mean through the foreign direct investment is how the Chinese government is investing in large-scale fixed capital projects, like building ports, to expand international trade between the two countries and to bring necessary products to China to support an economy with 1 billion people in it. So through that study and investigation, I learned so much more about what China's doing in Brazil, which brings me back down to Brazil. And I'm curious to see how the Brazilian approach to this is happening and what are the direct implications, what are the ramifications of such exchange or engagement at a local level in Brazil. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. But I'm going to take you on somewhat of a historical field trip too. I want to make sure that as I talk about these things that you understand Brazil in a much better and contemporary context, right? So a little bit of history will be given, and we'll talk about foreign policy attitudes in Brazil, and then we'll look at the case study that I hope to get at within the next calendar year, because I'm planning on going there and talking to people about the things that we're going to see tonight. So tonight, I should look up here, we're going to focus on Brazil in a regional and global context. We're going to, again, look at a brief history of Brazil starting in 1964, which is a pivotal year with military dictatorship. There was a takeover of the state called the Golpe do Estado. We're going to look at Brazil and China economic relations. We'll talk a little bit about the present-day foreign policy by the President Jair Bolsonaro. And then we're going to talk about some of the longer-term implications as a result of this interesting and what I call paradoxical relationship between the two countries. So here we are, the two leaders, Xi Jinping from China and Jair Bolsonaro, shaking hands at a meeting in 2019 or early 2020, just leading up to the pandemic, forming special partnerships and relationships. In fact, Bolsonaro visited Beijing, I believe in late 2019, November maybe, to set up some trading or expand trading relationships and so forth. What's interesting is Bolsonaro has a sort of a two-pronged approach to handling China, and we'll look at that. But I have these two questions highlighted here in yellow that I'd like for you to think about as you go along with me on this journey tonight. One is, what are the political economy and geographical implications of such an engagement between these two countries? That's one thing to think about. And the other is, does Brazil's engagement with China pose a long-term existential threat to local people and to the environment? So if we were to reverse engineer a research project, the big thing I want to learn most about is, what are the long-term implications for local people and their surroundings, their places where they live, the geography, as China builds ports and so forth? And what does it do to the environment in Brazil, including the Amazonian rainforest and interior? So that's the end game that we're looking at here, right? But in the meantime, we have to contextualize a few things with Brazil and so forth. So let's look at Brazil in both regional and global context. Now, Brazil is a country of nearly 218 million people. So it's a very large country. In fact, it is the most populous country within Latin America. It is the largest economy. The country of Brazil is just slightly smaller than the 48 contiguous United States. So it's a really big country, right? They speak Portuguese, so they're very different. Their ethnicity is combined of Caucasians and mixed races, and many people of African descent. In fact, within Brazil, you have racial interpretations that span a spectrum of 10 shades of color, right? So it's a very fluid racial environment, as well as minorities from Italy, Germany, and actually the largest Japanese population resides in São Paulo, outside of Japan. It's a neighborhood called Liberdade, and they're also throughout the country now. And many Japanese migrated to Brazil following the end of World War II. Right? So it's a very big country, and this shows you all the different states there that you see there. 26 states plus a federal district, like a District of Columbia. It's where Brasilia is located, sort of in the center of the country. So let's just go through a bit of history to understand how and why Brazil has this very interesting and paradoxical relationship with China these days. Well, it begins really in 1964, in my estimation, when a democratically elected government, which happened to be leftist and socialist in Brazil, was overtaken by the military because the military was afraid of communism. Think about this is about a year out from the Cuban Missile Crisis. The domino theory of communism was really strong within the world, from Vietnam to Cuba. And there was a real concern with conservative right-wing militaries that their countries will fall prey to what Cuba became like. So they intervened to reestablish democracy, as they said, and it was meant to be temporary, which actually lasted until 1985, right? So, in fact, if you read some history books about this period of 20 years or so within Brazil, many of the people who led Brazil or were part of that dictatorship never referred to themselves as dictators. They refer to themselves as authoritarian bureaucrats, which is a very interesting title, isn't it? Think about bureaucracy as already being dense, but then add more authoritarianism, and it becomes a brutal machine, right? So the golpe do Estado, or the takeover of the state, began, and it really put Brazil on a different trajectory. Now, this military takeover was in part supported by the United States government because it was anti-communist. And within that, they put a new development framework in place that put Brazil in a position to be comfortable with borrowing large amounts of money for large-scale investment projects. So you have here little photos up there of the military takeover in Brasilia and some of the protests happening around 1964 until the military really cracked down and said, no more, no dissent. Or you go to prison, you get re-educated, or you disappear. In the 1970s, we have what's also known as a result of this dictatorship, a a label called the economic miracle because Brazilian economic growth skyrocketed. Now, I'm not equating that economic miracles need to happen hand in hand with military governments. But what happened was the government, which was then cozier with countries like the United States, got lots of money to build large-scale investment projects, such as the port that you see here on the southeastern coast of Brazil. And I start with the port here because we're going full circle to see another port in development. And so all this money was borrowed, which ultimately led to a debt crisis in 1982 when the military government couldn't repay their debt so quickly. And that ultimately, between 82 and 1985, led to a 1980s democratic transition. So in 1985 to 1988, you have a succession of transitional leaders and elections and a new constitution formed by 1989 that put Brazil on its present-day democratic path. By the mid-1990s, Brazil was in a position to drop its weak currency as a result of the borrowed money, the debt crisis, and they created a new currency. And this was done by a new president, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was interesting because, unlike the dictators of the past, he was an academic, a trained sociologist, who actually wrote, and thinking of Global South Studies and the Journal and so forth, was one of the co-authors on the theory of dependency, or dependency theory, right? So he was very aware of the pitfalls of falling into debt again. So he started out initially as a finance minister within a democratic government, then elected president to initiate a new currency, and it was called the real, or the real, which means the royal, right? And so plural is reais. And if I say things like with H's, in Portuguese, all the R words, like Rio de Janeiro, is actually pronounced Rio de Janeiro. So forgive me if I slip into that, right? But as you can see up there, pictures of the new currency behind him and everything, Brazil got off to a new economic footing and was destined not to be in the debt trap, excuse me, anymore. So the Brazilian economy grew and grew. And by the early 2000s, another interesting event happened within Brazilian democracy. Think about this. Dictatorship, 1964, 1985, transition to democracy. By 2003, Brazil elects a socialist president. Think about that. Socialist president, full circle again. And this guy, known simply as, we'll go by Lula, that's his nickname, and that's why everyone calls him President Lula. He attempted to be president several times. He came from trade unions and the poor northeastern section of Brazil, and he became president. And not only did he become president, there was not 1 ounce of saber rattling or threat from the military to intervene yet again. The economy was on good footing, and the Cold War had ended. So he became president. He was not so much leftist anymore. He was much more centrist, center-left maybe, to put it that way. And he was in office for 8 years. Then his successor from the same Workers' Party, the PT, became president. And she served 4 years, and during her second term, she was impeached, right, because of alleged corruption. At the same time, there was corruption all over the place in the Brazilian government, right? And they had a series of scandals from Lula to Dilma Rousseff, the female president, Brazil's first female president, and then also within even more conservative elements of the government. And they had to clean it all out. They called it Lava Jato, or the car wash, just wash it all out, right? So there was a lot of turmoil within Brazilian domestic politics, which opened the gateway for somewhat of an outsider. He was already in Congress, but a real outlier on Brazilian political landscapes. Here we have him here, Jair Bolsonaro, who's the current president, up for re-election this year, in fact. And he has taken Brazil kind of in a 180-degree turn from where the previous two administrations were. Brazilian political spectrum is really complicated, lots of parties, several coalitions, and so forth. If you study European politics, think about Italy, but like on a much, much bigger scale, right? And he would be what we would probably call a neoconservative, but extreme right neoconservative. In fact, he served within the military government, the dictatorship, in years past. And he's even mentioned that it would be a good thing to go back to that, because that brings law, back to the flag, order and progress, law and order, and we'll get the crime off the streets when the military is on the streets, right? Well, that's not really such a great idea, probably. Militaries are not meant to police their own people, but to defend their people. So within the past few years, Jair Bolsonaro has taken Brazil to new levels of engagement with countries like China. And that's in part because during the Lula administration, Brazil's economy grew at exponential rates, high rates, like 7% annually, until it slowed down. And right now, the average growth rate of the economy, if you follow economics, is about 1.5, 1.2%. It ebbs and flows right now. So this kind of brief history will let us understand where Brazil came from. Because keep in mind, Brazil has always been attracted to big-scale projects. One of the ambitions of the military government in the 1960s was to make Brazil an economic superpower, a powerhouse. Brazil, in fact, is a powerhouse in many different ways. It's an agricultural powerhouse. Because of its geographical latitudes, on average, it has 3 growing seasons. So it supplies a lot of food to the world. It also has a lot of ranching and has a lot of space. So it has those things going for it. But it really wanted to become a much more diversified, high-end technology-based economy. And to some degree, it's achieved that. But it's still a country of extremes. You may have heard of this terminology, the haves, the have-nots. Brazil is a country of haves and have-nots. And it's also geographically concentrated in the southeast where the haves live, and also where the cities are located. So it's a country of high levels of uneven development. And as we look at this new port that is being funded by the Chinese, it's being built in an area of have-nots, okay, in the northeastern part of Brazil. So here's a photo of the two currencies, and let's think about, since, realistically, the early 2000s, let's think about the economic relationships with China. In the early 2000s, Brazil joined a group of other emerging powers. Has anyone ever heard of the BRICS before? Brazil, what's the other country? Russia for now, maybe not in 6 months, but it started out with Russia, India, China, what's the S you think? South Africa, exactly. So I'm always proud that Brazil's at the beginning of that, right? So its economy grew really quickly, and so Brazil started to create, if you will, a club. They were part of a club with these other countries. So it became natural for Brazil and China to start talking more and more with one another. Realistically, there wasn't much trade between the two countries until the early 2000s. I can remember living in Brazil in the 1990s, and you would look at, things that you would normally find in this country made in China. It was always made in Brazil, But by the early to mid 2000s, when my kids were buying toys in Brazil, you look at the back and it would say, made in China, which just kind of like, really? There's so much poverty in Brazil. If it's about cheap labor, they could do it here, but they could get the labor even cheaper still in China, believe it or not. So they started engaging on those levels. But then China became increasingly interested in Brazil. Why? Again, China has 1 billion people. It needs resources, food, right? So beef, soybeans, they use a lot of soy in China. It also imports lumber from China. To some extent, it's importing petroleum, which won't really affect the area that I am studying, but it imports petroleum from Brazil, as well as a few other things. And it's also now looking at Brazil as an integral part of its global framework of international trade. So I pulled this data quickly from The Economist magazine to show you kind of what one statistical study showed of, Chinese investment in Brazil in terms of billions of dollars. It starts out really high in 2010 and kind of ebbs and flows again. By the mid part of the decade, 2015, 2016, 2017, it's pretty healthy. And then you see a drop again, and then a steep rise again, and it's been sort of a roller coaster. Towards the end, the roller coaster effect has been COVID, right? But what we can say is that Chinese investment has been steady. In fact, when I did another piece of research, I found there's an academic at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, Gabriel de Barros de Torres, and he writes the following. So I was taking this data, but then he says, well, not so fast. There's a slight creep effect. It may not look apparent on a chart like this, but Chinese investment is creeping in year by year. He says, during the past decade, meaning 2010 through 2020, a major shift has taken place in the nature of Brazil-China economic relations. Although merchandise trade remains the leading bilateral flow, amounting to a record high of around $98 billion by 2018, Chinese foreign direct investment in Brazil has grown consistently since 2010. Between 2007 and 2018, the stock of confirmed Chinese investments in Brazil reached around $58 billion. $58 billion. Consolidating China as the 9th top global investor in Brazil. From the Chinese perspective, Brazil represented the 4th top destination of foreign direct investment in the same period. Within Latin America, Brazil represents by far the main recipient of Chinese foreign direct investment, having absorbed 53% of Chinese investments in the region between 2007 and again 2018. So we have an economist here from the Catholic University in Rio doing this study saying that yes, there's been a roller coaster effect, but China has put money in long-term investment projects, fixed capital, and that's language we use in geography to talk about, building ports, which are fixed on the landscape. You don't pick up a port and move it somewhere else the way you do perhaps, a factory, if you want to close a factory and rebuild another factory. These are long-term investments that, and no pun intended, that will anchor Chinese trade with Brazil for the long haul, okay? So we have that, and that's an important consideration to remember. Here are just if you're curious about products that are being traded or exported to China, these are the top products here, and I'm gonna walk this way quickly just so I can see them again. So top ones are soy, iron ore, and it's all blurry from this, and crude oil, like I said, beef, and you see the rest going down here. You see cellulose as well. I think that's cellulose up there. And Brazil actually imported a lot of eucalyptus trees from Australia back in the 1950s to make cellulose. And that's another environmental consideration because it's creating drought in certain parts of Brazil because they absorb a lot of water. So we understand now that the economic relationship has grown, and it's more recent than not. But I would be remiss to say that Brazil's relationship with Beijing is not necessarily a recent thing. In fact, Brazil recognized the People's Republic of China, Beijing, in 1974 as the official China, and no longer considered Taiwan or the Republic of China as the official China. Pretty much in lockstep with the Nixon administration when George Bush Sr. was the diplomat that went to China as the first ambassador with this new recognition. So Brazil, in terms of foreign policy recognition of China, has been in lockstep with the United States pretty much all of these years. It really was around the time that the BRICS came onto the political economy landscape that we see Brazil pivot to China in a new way, in a much more economical and perceived beneficial, mutually beneficial, reciprocal way, right? So there have been, recognitions of 48 years of this. Now, the Brookings Institution, however, states that more recently, Brazil has found itself in an interesting contradictory position with China. So here, this is a really great image, by the way, of the two countries from the China Daily. Harold Trinkinus at the Brookings Institution, this is just the quote that says that during periods when it sought international autonomy, Brazil has found in China an attractive partner in criticizing the liberal international order fostered by the US in the wake of World War II. The way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. That was Brazil's attitude by the 2010s and so forth. What does this all mean? I'm sure if you follow the news, or if you read things like Foreign Affairs, or follow international outlets of different sorts that talk about the challenge to democracy these days, that there is a challenge to the liberal world order. The liberal world order doesn't mean that necessarily you're a liberal, as we think of it on the left spectrum of politics. It is the liberal world order that embraces democracies and freer market economies, okay? The illiberal world order are the ones that are much more dominated by authoritarian regimes. Think of Putin in Russia. Think of Xi Jinping, China, right? And in some ways, not quite to that extreme, but certainly there are tendencies of the Bolsonaro foreign policy approach to cozy up with these illiberal world governments or national governments, to engage in trade. Case in point, the week of the attacks in Kyiv by Russian forces, the week that the United Nations met, you may recall that they're discussing the problem with Ukraine and Russia. Meanwhile, Russian troops are actually invading as the UN's actually meeting, right? That very week, a few days before that, Jair Bolsonaro traveled to Moscow to sign a trade agreement with Putin, despite the White House's request to not do this and show some solidarity with your Western allies. He still went anyway, right? So there is an interesting, where you say, show me, don't tell me. This is like one of those moments where actions speak louder than words, right? Of how he and his administration tend to see, foreign relations. Now, that having been said, Jair Bolsonaro has also been extremely critical of China because he's a populist. So he doesn't want people in Brazil to actually think that he's cozying up to becoming, a Chinese pawn in this global trading network that we're going to look at. But nonetheless, there has been a tendency to, when it's convenient for Brazil, to ignore the liberal world order and engage with it, with the alternative, which is not really an alternative perhaps, and try to play both sides, which is where the paradoxical situation or the contradictory situation actually begins. So what is Brazil's approach? As I've just said, to reiterate, paradoxical at best, right? There's a word in Portuguese which means a mess, and I tend to joke around saying this is a big bagunça. Bagunça is a mess, right? So, how does a country try to speak out of both sides of its mouth at the same time when it comes to foreign policy? Because the United States remains an important trading partner, of course, right? It still does. But Brazil, has increased its trading relationship with China, as we talked about, as well with the foreign direct investment. So let's see here. What do we have here? So let's look at some examples of the Jair Bolsonaro foreign policy in general, and then we'll look at it with respect to China. This is when President Trump was still in office, and I'm not trying to get involved into American political polarization by any means. It's an example. He very much liked the Trumpian approach. He took the playbook from Trump's Twitter book and reinterpreted it into a Brazilian cultural context. In fact, some people in the social sciences have called him the tropical Trumpista, right? Or in Brazil, some people joke calling him the Trumpista. He likes to be brash. He's learned to be kind of offensive on Twitter. He likes to, make fun of Macron, the president of France, for example, when he wants to get popularity in his own country. He plays by that book. And this is when he was visiting the White House. And number 10, by the way, if you follow any kind of global soccer, and that's religion in Brazil. There's Catholicism, right? And you have the Pope, but during a World Cup year, it kind of alternates, and suddenly the World Cup dominates all religion, and people are going for number 10, which is often seen as the best player on the team. And so a special jersey was given to Trump with the national football jersey from Brazil. So he really does kind of cozy up to that kind of approach in foreign policy. Not to mention, as I said, going to Russia here, right? So within China itself, he has, visited China. The Chinese premier has come to Brazil. And he has overseen, as a president, an agreement to allow a Chinese construction company to move into this pocket of northeastern Brazil that we're going to look at, right? And so while he's speaking to the very population in the Northeast, especially during an election year, that China is not going to take over, China is not going to make us dependent on them, China is investing in us because we're Brazil, we're a top producer, we're this, and that. The reality is that this approach towards China is part of China's actual foreign policy and political economy playbook. China is hopeful that it can, and I hope this slide opens up here, can expand what's known as the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, which is also known as the New Silk Road. Anybody study world history, the Silk Road of ancient times, Marco Polo, things like that? There is a new trading pathway being emerged across the Eurasian landmass, and China is at the center of it. In fact, China has created its own version of the World Bank called the AIIB, the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, and it is meant to rival the World Bank. Think about this. The World Bank, based in DC, is grounded and connected with liberal world orders, liberal democracies, freer market democracies, and the AIIB is now giving competitive loans to countries for large infrastructure projects. But it's through what we would call an illiberal government or an authoritarian government. And there are different kinds of strings attached to both kinds of loans, obviously, with repayment and so forth. But what happens with this New Silk Road or the Belt Road Initiative project is that Chinese companies move in with their own construction groups. They build the ports, they build the railroads, they build the highways and bridges and so forth. And oftentimes an agreement is established with exclusive rights to natural resources that will be taken out of the country. So in the case of Brazil, with the port that we're going to look at in an area called São Luís, the port would provide Brazil with direct access to grains and to some finished products, but also timber and beef, right? Much of this is now being harvested out of the Amazonian basin. So you've always heard that the Amazon, which is this gigantic carbon sequester for the world's climate, right? Trees are being cut down, and increasingly so under the Bolsonaro government, who actually downsized its version of the EPA and now has doubled or more its illegal poaching activities, as well as officially state-sanctioned activities in the Amazon. Land is being cleared out for cattle grazing, for beef exports to China, is being cut cut down to create soybean farms with irrigation, as well as a lot of lumber coming out of the forest that will be sent over for things like furniture production, things like that in China. So as you can see here in Brazil, here on the far right of the screen, you have a big star. And this is where this port of São Luís is being built, okay? And geographically, it's close to the Panama Canal. It's situated on the Atlantic, but not too far south where the big cities of Brazil are located. But it's also positioned quite easily. There's the location there. Well, I'll have arrows a little bit later, but if you go to the southwest a little bit, you go straight into the Amazon, right? So it's positioned, its relative location is pretty easy for extract and export industries, okay? Now, anytime you build a big port, you have this idea of eminent domain, right? The government has made a decision, the federal government in Brazil, working with the state government, working with private contractors, and this is where, on the map, the port will be built. As I mentioned, Brazil is also a place of uneven development. So in the northeast of Brazil, you have the poorest of the poor living in the country, right? And so these people who really can't afford to buy land elsewhere are actually being displaced, from their land through this port construction, which began in 2019, was supposed to be finished in 21. I think it's still in the finishing stages because of the pandemic. But hopefully we can learn a little bit more about this. And if technology is my friend, which usually it's not, we're going to try to watch a couple YouTube clips here, all right? And I don't know if I'll have sound or not, but hopefully we will, right? So we have here soybean production, just some images that I got. Here you have cattle ranching on the Amazon, and you kind of see the scale of where it's grazed, and then where you have the actual Amazon rainforest in the background. One of the challenges of doing this, if you've studied environmental science, is that once you clear tropical rainforest, the soils become pretty infertile pretty quickly because the canopy up there protects the underbrush, right, in the soils. But once it's gone and you still have the tropical downpours every day from the Amazon and the humidity, the nutrients in the soil, which are really thin on the landscape, get leached and become dead in a way. So it's just grasses. So then the cows remain there and so forth. And again, here's some just examples of some of the timber industries, both legal and illegal, that you see in the Amazon. So this port will have a direct impact, not just on the Amazon and Brazil's national environment, but also has global implications if we're concerned about climate change and things of that sort. All right, so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to see if I can get this YouTube to play. What we're going to see, it's just a couple of minutes, is an actual news report in English, not Portuguese, about the port. Now, this was never played on CNN or any of the mainstream things or BBC. This is actually the English-speaking Chinese news network for the Americas. So it took some digging for me to find it, but I found it. We're going to see if this will play for us, and I hope that it will. If not, and if there's no sound, just look at some of the images, and you'll get a sense of the scope, the scale of this port from Chinese investment, okay? Fingers crossed.
China's hunger for commodities like grains from Brazil seems endless, and shipping them halfway around the globe is a task that demands infrastructure and investment.
Itaqui is one of the busiest ports in Brazil, and as demand keeps growing, new investment is needed. And such growth has a lot to do with China.
A new port is now in initial stages of construction here in São Luís, the capital of the state of Maranhão. It's an investment of almost $500 million from a consortium led by Chinese construction company CCCC. The plan is to have it operational in the next 3 years. The port will have a bridge that runs 1 kilometer into the sea, so ships 3 at a time will have a depth of at least 20 meters to dock. The port's CEO says this is a prime location for China's logistics needs.
This is the northern arch of Brazil. And from here, you have, you're very close to the Panama Canal. You're very close to the east coast of the United States. You're close to Europe, and you're also closer through Panama Canal to reach China.
The port of São Luís is the most advanced Chinese infrastructure investment planned for Brazil's northeast, the country's poorest region. The vice governor of the state of Maranhão says the region is eager for more Chinese investment.
Os chineses têm o que a gente precisa. Eles têm.
The Chinese have what we need. They have resources, technology, and are interested in expanding their business around the world. So I think this is good for everybody. For us, this is important, as it creates jobs, increases wages, and improves people's quality of life.
This project allows the Chinese to increase their supply of raw materials. They are our biggest customers for iron ore, soy, and animal protein. The project will also put them closer to big consumer markets.
However, big infrastructure projects often cause local disruptions. In the case of the port of São Luís, the company and the state are still dealing with a traditional community, the Cajueiro, which have been resisting eviction.
It's annoying for us. We don't really know what's going to happen to us. I live in a very small house. I wanted to enlarge it, but not now, because I'm afraid of being evicted.
In the port of São Luís, construction work is picking up speed, and in a few years ships will be docking and taking Brazilian products to China and the rest of the world, while bringing in the imports the country needs. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, São Luís do Maranhão, Brazil.
So as you saw in the report, which was done probably late 2019 or early 2020, before the pandemic hit, you see that this is a pretty massive investment to think about a bridge for trucks to go out into the sea 1 kilometer so that it can meet up with super tankers, that they could bring 3 super tankers in at a time while others are queued up out in the ocean is pretty interesting. And he also mentioned the connection with the Panama Canal. What he didn't mention is that China's also investing heavily in an alternative canal zone through Nicaragua, which will go through Lake Nicaragua, and it will be already large enough to contain the largest super tankers. The Panama Canal is kind of tight, even for super tankers, but this one will be even bigger. So again, as China kind of expands that big network that we saw of all the trading ports and so forth, the Nicaragua project will also become one that will feed into this port as well. So in the report you saw the man, they're from this area, they're called the Cujeiros, and he was talking about, I don't want to be moved off my land, I'm afraid that if I put things in my house, we're going to have to move and so forth. So here are some images where eminent domain has taken effect in São Luís as a result of this Chinese investment project, right? And one of the things you have to keep asking is, well, what's the greater good? Is it the environment, global and national? Is it international trade with China and bringing in port jobs? Or is it protecting indigenous communities that were there all these years who are simple fishermen and have always lived there, right? So these are the kind of debates that we're thinking about, right? And that's why there are real geographical implications to what's happening here. So here is just, some of the home that was pushed, off the landscape. Here is another person that is in a news article that I read. His name is Carlos Augusto Barboza, and you see he has a fishing net. He's a fisherman, right? He's just a simple person who makes very little money, but this is where he's always known. He wouldn't know where to go. And as they build the port and people are kind of get moved off, this will become the corridor of trade that goes into the port that then gets sent over by super container through either Panama Canal or the Nicaraguan Canal when it finally opens to ports like Shanghai in China. So I have one more short video, which is really an underground video. And I'll warn you, it's police reacting against the very local community. This is not from news, this is raw video that I was able to obtain. And it shows the actual protest against the police as tractors and other construction equipment are being moved into their community. And I think as we end this presentation tonight, it gives you a sense of how palpable this is at local levels, and that what's happening at a very local level is actually part of a global framework of political economy. And as Brazil plays with China on this front, as well as trying to also placate the United States, that there are local communities that are kind of caught in the crosshairs of this bigger project in San Luis. So I'm gonna go back over here and play this. It's just about a minute long, and then I'll end the presentation and take some questions, okay? 1 sec.
Tá grávida aí a menina, viu? Tá grávida. Vai, sai, deixa ele matar. Ele quer matar. Vai. Ele você não pode buscar ela não, viu? Quebrar, vai sair só homem.
So as we conclude tonight, and we think about how a project like this is actually one of geographical scale. I'm a geographer, we think in terms of scale. We have political economy relations at global scales between China and Brazil at play. At national scales, we have a government approaching foreign policy in new and interesting and different ways, but also a populist leader within the national framework who is trying to also inform people that Chinese investment's important, but he's not going to be a pawn to China, okay? And then at local levels, especially here in San Luis where the port is being constructed, people who are, again, caught in these crosshairs, these people who have no agency or ability to fight or defend themselves, they don't have the income, their lives are connected to fishing, and they would have to resettle somewhere else, which can be pretty difficult in Brazil. So you might become part of the landless movement, which is fairly sizable in a country like Brazil. And the government doesn't necessarily give assistance to those kinds of people as they get pushed off their land, right? And then you also have, again, in terms of geographic scale, the long-term impacts of the Amazon, and what does that do to global climate and global environment issues? And how does that affect Brazil's national protection of the environment? And what is it doing, again, locally with ecology, right? So you have these tensions at work. And that, to me, is where I plan on getting my feet grounded when I get there to actually learn more about this. So this is where my research is at present. I will conclude with that and take any questions that you may have. So thank you for your attention tonight. Yeah, I'll jump in.
Setting aside the obvious global reach of the Belt and Road Project specifically, and setting aside specific countries, is there a region of the world where China isn't steadily increasing its foreign direct investment?
Antarctica? No, I'm joking. Arguably, perhaps the United States, where we're much more protective of these things, although Chinese investment happens here in the state, even in Georgia. No, Chinese investment is around the world, and in fact, I shouldn't even say the US, because the Chinese hold so many US dollars, right? So many bonds. So I would say not. I mean, I think people talk about this new Cold War developing between the People's Republic of China and the United States. I don't know if it's really a Cold War or if it's simply a different interpretation of the way capitalist economies should operate, if we can call it capitalist. I call it authoritative capitalism, right? But I think it's trying to provide an alternative world order within which they maintain the hegemony. And it's that hegemonic influence that they want to maintain, much like the US maintains hegemony, right, with its trading partners as the world's largest economy. But it's through that hegemonic relationship with countries like Brazil that a new dependency is created, or Rwanda, Africa, or Kenya, or Sri Lanka, or Pakistan, wherever ports and railroads are being built. Yeah.
So my follow-on question is, with its history of protectionism, import substitution, et cetera.
I mean Brazil's, right?
Brazil.
Yes, yeah.
Is there anything different about Brazilian foreign policy and its terms of FDI into Brazil that's different from the foreign policy of other countries in their pursuit of Chinese FDI?
Well, Brazil's, if you were, my daughter's godmother in Sao Paulo is a tax attorney. And Brazil has one of the most complicated investment tax schemes for foreign investors. It's extremely difficult to actually invest in Brazil. Foreign companies have for years, because of import substitution industries, have had difficult time doing things like that. But here it seems a little different because this is not a company, but this is a government with government-owned companies coming in. So it's almost like deals are being brokered between politicians, right? And so I think that's what makes it different with China versus...
So China is, do any other countries pursue a different strategy of foreign policy to attract FDI from China?
From China, oh, okay.
Like, is there anything different about Brazil?
Brazil. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily different from other countries. It's pretty similar. I was in Guatemala over spring break, and I was looking at foreign direct investment there as well, just through the news and stuff, and it seems pretty similar. I think the big difference is the scale that Brazil is, right? And I think that's what makes it stand out more, and that it has all these agricultural and other natural resources that it can play into this. So a country like Guatemala wouldn't have petroleum to share, right? But petroleum gives Brazil a bargaining chip. That doesn't make it as dependent as a smaller economy like Guatemala will be, right? You know, so I think it's that. I think it's cocktail mixture of natural resources that, and scale and size, that makes it different. And that's how they play the game a little differently, because they know they have these things that China needs as well. So it's still, I think, more dependent on China. It's not an equal exchange by any means. Yeah. Hi, yes.
As a biologist, I'm more concerned about the destruction of the Amazon forest. Is there anything the rest of the world can do about it? I know it's in their area and territory, and that's what they're developing into it, but that is going to be impacting not just climate change, but biodiversity and everything else that can be an issue.
Absolutely.
And so is there anything we, as everyone else, can do, other countries, since it's in their...
I hate to be the pessimist and say no, but probably not. In fact, when Bolsonaro was elected into office 4 years ago, he created his first diplomatic scuffle was with France's Macron, President Macron, because Macron said about the Paris Climate Accord and so forth, and Brazil had signed on to it, that Brazil, and he basically said Brazil needs to take care of this for the rest of the world. The onus is on you, it's your responsibility, but if you can't, let us be a partner with you and help, right? He rejected it. He said, this is neocolonialism. This is Europe, again, making its mark on Brazilian soil and making us, again, dependent on their trade rules and dependent on this and threats of sanction. So he basically refuted it. So as long as the Brazilian government, and in particular with this particular president, and we'll see what happens in a year from now, if he's still in power, if it changes tones again, its tune again, remains very nationalist. And he actually is a president who has already basically said climate change and study is ridiculous. He says it's pseudoscience and so forth. So again, he's playing on that kind of rhetoric. So until that, and maybe, and it's not just him, we have political parties, coalitions that support him, right? They're in the Congress in Brasilia. As long as that's happening there, like it is in our own country with climate skeptics and the like about environmental protectionism, I think it will be difficult for multilateral groups of countries to come in and partner or help Brazil, or unless it goes to the UN and then there's political pressure and sanctions put on Brazil, but I don't see that happening personally. So it's an unfortunate scenario, but yeah, and Brazil, I mean, other countries, there are 9 countries that have the Amazon too, but Brazil has the big chunk of it too, so. Well, yeah, welcome to the Anthropocene, right? Yes. Yes, sir, in the back, and I don't know if there are other, but yes. Can you speak up? I can't hear you. I got a fan blowing around here. Sorry, let me move up. I can't hear you. Sorry, I'm just getting old too.
Do you believe that there are any outside concerns from countries outside of Brazil and China that are concerned about the nature of their relationship? Or are there any
Yes, the United States, first and foremost. And then maybe the European Union. I don't see other countries in Latin America being as concerned. They have their own trading pacts like, Mercosur, which is sort of like a common market of trading goods in the Southern Cone. But Argentina's playing the China game, Chile's playing the China game, they're all doing it. So if there's only concern, it's like, there may be concern that a country like Brazil, which is economically so much bigger, may beat them to the punch in getting things, right? So there's competition, competitive spirit in that. But I think realistically it's the United States who's probably concerned because, since the Monroe Doctrine, where we've considered Latin America our backyard, right? First it was Russia with Cuba and Nicaragua and now Venezuela, and now you have China kind of investing. It's repositioning, again, that kind of foreign policy tone that makes people in the State Department in Washington, D.C. pause, I think. It's a great question. Thanks. Yes, sir.
What do you think about
I think it's going to be a big bagunza again, big mess, right? If Brazil can do anything well, it's have a great party, Carnival, right? And if it can do anything not so well, it's probably pull off an election, without a lot of, mudslinging. So it's interesting because President Lula, I did not mention this, was imprisoned for corruption charges, only to have that imprisonment overturned by a Supreme Court justice in the last year, which means that now he has a clean record. He can actually run for government again, and he's running against Bolsonaro as president for a 3rd term. So it's only going to reinforce, I'm afraid, the polarization in Brazil between the far right and then someone who's on center left, right, but is being labeled a communist and a socialist by the far right. And I think any kind of political voice in between in the moderate zone is going to be just silenced. I think all the oxygen will be sucked out of the air by Bolsonaro's end and then the Lula end. And Lula is getting a lot of support to run again. And it's almost as if it were the comeback kid or his revenge against the system that unfairly imprisoned him, according to him. So, yes. And he's very popular with the poor. He brought a lot of social programs to the poor, so he's very popular. Good question. Well, thank you, or obrigado, as they say in Brazil. Have a good evening. I appreciate you coming. It's been great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Spears. I want to thank all of you for your participation this evening, the students, faculty, and staff for joining us, and a special thanks to Dr. Grissett and the Office of Experiential Learning for collaborating with us to make this a Windows to the World event. For those of you who are here tonight for your Windows to the World credit, please make sure you check in with Dr. Grissett. She's standing at the exit door. Also, if you're here for my class or Dr. Bergman's class for extra credit, please make sure that you sign one of those sign-in sheets so that we can record your attendance at tonight's meeting. Thank you.